Welcome back to the series of the Staff College having courageous conversations about race. With me are three amazing women, all of whom are involved in working with leaders in the UK and in other countries, and brave enough to have conversations about race. We have Rosemary Campbell-Stephens, MBE, who has coined the term global majority, which we explain and discuss in our first episode titled The Language We Use Matters. Catherine Pereira, Director of NHS Horizons, who says that white people, men in particular, frame the language which frames ideas, which inform our mindsets, all of which ultimately manifests in our behaviours. And Jo Davidson, Principal of the Staff College, who wonders why we've been so coy about using leadership models which incorporate the experience of other cultures. In our previous two episodes, we have been talking about what the term global majority means. We have explored different aspects of race and culture, which all of us find difficult to talk about and has, at times, given us pause for thought. We have also been searching for ways to change the fixed notion of leadership in the West. We wanted to share our conversations with listeners in the hope that it can help you to start your own courageous conversations with friends and colleagues, because unless we're prepared to take that risk, we can't shift anything. We're bound to get some things wrong, and we will probably fumble a little, and at times it may be clumsy or awkward, but these women have come together in what I hope is a safe space to have an open, honest, and courageous conversation. In this episode, we ask, where do you get your knowledge? If you have a management qualification, what were you taught? What examples were you given? What case studies shared to shape the discourse? How does that translate into everyday practice at work? And does it result in a fixed notion of what leadership looks like, with leaders never really bringing their whole selves to work? I'm Sherry Malik, and this is our third and final episode, The Harvard Way or the Global Leadership Way. Let's get to the bottom of these questions with our guests. Let's start with you, Jo. You've been a director for 15 years. What did you draw on as a leader? And, who were your role models?
Thanks, Sherry. I guess I think all of us, when we get into leadership positions, have to dig really deep in terms of our values, where we come from, what we think about the work that we do and people. So I guess, my models came from a number of different sources. I think just kicking off with management qualification that you covered in your introduction there, that, as I think we've covered in other podcasts, I think was shamefully white set of management and leadership theories. Although, having said that, the ones I gravitated to were the ones that particularly helped me understand that there wasn't a right answer, there wasn't a right thing to do, that leadership wasn't just a simple equation that you did this, A plus B times Z brackets B squared minus C cubed equals, and there you are, you've got a perfect solution. So I was very drawn, and still use very much, people like Ron Heifetz and adaptive leadership. The work we did on our directors programme very much involved Keith Grin and Wicked Issues, Erman Turbot and the adaptive space and the work that he did in Ireland. And that was all, and clumsy solutions, all of that was, I found incredibly empowering, and I sort of modelled a lot of my stuff on that, because it suddenly made sense to me. But I guess that as a leader, you don't just take those people as role models, it's people in the world around you as well. Mm-hmm. And I drew a lot of my leadership from a number of the elected members that I worked with. So elected members who were appeared incredibly sure-footed in the community and ward work that they did, have very clear visions for what they wanted to do, but did it in that almost servant leadership type style, where they were working with and for their communities and they could gather seemingly incredibly disparate, at opposite ends of spectrum people together and create something really magical that gave agency to the community, never took the agency away from them. And I think, what was the defining feature of those role models? And it was the fact that they were true to themselves. They saw themselves not as some kind of anointed leader that had, were elected on, to perform something on behalf of their community, and therefore they did what they wanted. They were people that saw themselves as rooted in their place, and their job was to galvanise people and develop the thinking around a community and within a community to let other local people take responsibility and progress things as well. And that really appealed to me because, bearing in mind when I started my leadership role, I was one of the first senior female women in the country in local government at that time. And so a lot of my time I was facing something that felt like it was a very assertive, very definite style of leadership that didn't leave much room for deliberation, reflection, uncertainty, feeling your way, that sort of thing. So, that plus what I grew up in my childhood. And I sometimes reflect on, children's books I read and heroes that I still carry with me. And that would be a whole other podcast.
Yes. Yes, lots of heroes in children's books, I guess. But Catherine, bring you into this discussion about, you and what did you draw on as a leader, and who was your role model?
Yeah, that's really interesting to know, Jo. I think the power of stories, you and I have known each other for years, but to hear that adds to my, my understanding and my hat off respect as well. Sherry, when I think about three leaders, so the three people who, with hindsight, have most influenced how I think about leadership, it would be my mum, who grew up and came of age during a war in the Troubles in Northern Ireland and experienced the realities of that war. I remember when I said that I was going to marry my husband, who was a Londoner of Sri Lankan origin, my mum was genuinely upset. And the reason she was upset initially was, she said, when I came here, it was no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, that I was denied work. I do not want that for you, for your children. And she had an experience which, even in her 70s now, continues to play out, I think, in trauma and memory. And yet, despite that, built a career as a youth worker, dedicated herself to public service, worked hard and continues to do so on behalf of her community. I think of my aunt, her big sister, who died last week from COVID-19 and complications of underlying health conditions. But the reason I think of her is, one, yes, another strong Ulster woman, but a woman who, when she became pregnant in 1973, was told by her bank, congratulations, where she worked, congratulations and we'll miss you, legally dismissed.
Oh, gosh.
Policy that related to married women, right?
Yes.
And I think of my grandmother. So my grandmother was the fiercest intellect that I've ever met in my life. Her name was Nan McGonigal. And she graduated the top in the whole of Ireland in her bar exams and was called to the bar as a barrister. She worked for 30 years as a mum of 4 children and a widow, as a legal secretary, because she was Catholic. She was a woman, and that was simply the way that it was. So when I think about what keeps me going, why did I go to the bar, become a barrister? Why did I practice for those years? Why did I stand for public office? Why do I do things that are frightening but feel important? Those are the models that I feel like are standing, as Rosemary has said on the earlier podcast, that are standing right behind me and in whose shadow I get to stand. The other thing I would say is iconoclasts, rebels, people who have one foot on the edge, one foot in the system. I don't know why, I'm fascinated by those people. So I've had the chance to work with civil rights organizers, political campaigners, people who are always rocking the boat and trying to stay in it. And there's something in that space of leadership, the creative potential of keeping your foot just enough on the edge, that I find really inspiring.
Catherine, you've just that has been inspiring for me to hear. I think the three women in your life seem to be giants, really, on whose shoulders you can comfortably stand. So thank you for sharing that, really. And I just wanted to really ask Rosemary, because obviously I think you are, and I know, Catherine, you describe yourself as not British, but Irish. In that sense, you are British, but your heritage and your culture is Irish, and you very much see yourself as that. And Jo, you've described yourself as a woman of the world, really, because of your dad traveling around so much. But Rosemary, you grew up here. The question really is, why do you think you rejected this notion of Harvard leadership as the perfect model? And what and who inspired you? Because your parents come from the Windrush generation, and you've moved back to Jamaica, and you've got this kind of foot around, well, you've got a reach around the world, really, talking to people about this global majority concept. So really, why do you think you've rejected this notion of Harvard leadership as the perfect model? And who's inspired you?
Oh, fantastic question and fantastic stories. Just listening to Jo and Catherine. I haven't rejected the Harvard model of leadership, but I have blended it with global paradigms of leadership, and I think that's the pragmatic answer to your question, Sherry. And the reason that I've done that is because of who I have been inspired by. And the people that I've been inspired by are very similar in terms of Catherine and Jo's experiences. It comes from my family and more broadly from my community, as I see myself as a Black African Caribbean woman. And so that community has had a very big footprint on the world stage. When I think about going through my training, my Western training in terms of leadership, whenever the question was asked of all of us as participants within that training, who are the leaders, alive or dead, who have inspired you in terms of your thinking about what it is to be a leader? Predominantly African people of African descent, Black African descent, were amongst those people for everybody. So everybody would say Nelson Mandela, everybody would say Dr. Martin Luther King, everybody would say Gandhi, everybody would. So from Black and global majority cultures, there's a kind of acceptance that we bring something to the table that is not only additional, but it kind of lifts us all to another level of humanity. So for me, right from the very beginning, I've been inspired by being Black. And I've been very culturally anchored in terms of the way that I've approached not only my own development, but my thinking about leadership. I haven't seen it as something deficit. I've seen it as something that I've brought to the table. And, if I could just share this really quick one. When I was doing my MBA at University College London, just by being a participant within the MBA and just responding in a very normal way to questions that were asked, but from my cultural, global, Pan-African, Garveyite perspective, the conversation then went, well, would you like to contribute to the program? So that I was there as a participant, and then they'd asked me to actually do some teaching on the MBA. And that was about bringing the perspective into, which was what was ironically an MBA in international leadership. But because it had been formed from a Western model of thinking, by having somebody who's coming from a global perspective as a student, they then thought, oh, we need some of those perspectives to inform, what it is that we're doing and talking about. So for me, it's always been about going back to my cultural roots, being really culturally anchored, and understanding that the fact that that's been marginalized and pushed out and not something that's been recognized by Western business schools doesn't mean that it isn't needed, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. And so I've rejected this kind of hierarchy of knowledge that comes through in terms of who has the knowledge and what knowledge is valuable. Because whenever I've put it on the table, however gently and respectfully, it actually has been well received. Yes. And it's not about pushing out what's already there. It's just adding some seasoning. If you see it as a pot of soup, yes. And the pot of soup is the Western model of leadership. Well, sometimes, Sherry, you need to add a little bit of coriander.
Yes, or garam masala, as I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very good. And as you were talking about this, I think that my thought was, I was thinking about myself as an emerging leader, and then at the point in my life when I think I had quite a lot of experience, but I was just over 50 when I felt myself relax as a leader and felt able to bring in the sort of concepts that you're talking about, to bring in that little bit of spice into the conversation and the mix, and see things from my perspective, from my cultural background or lens, as it were. And I guess up until then, I hadn't felt like I was bringing my whole self to work. And the question, I suppose, is for all of us here to think about how we can support leaders to bring their whole selves to work. Because when I started to bring my whole self to work, I know I was a much better leader. People connected with me more. So how can we support leaders to bring their whole selves to work? Kick off with Joe first.
I think that's the most powerful thing that leaders can be, is authentic, and it means being natural, but also in terms of getting there, to be quite deliberate about what you are bringing to work. It's funny, sort of leaders, they're very public figures, aren't they? And yet it's astonishing, really, the number of leaders that are actually pretty shy and introverted when you talk to them. So I think there's something incredibly important about leaders, whether you're supporting leaders, emerging leaders in your own organisation, or you're a development organisation like we are, about the type of conversations that you have with people that really, where you give of yourself, something about yourself, or several things about yourself, but you're also curious and inquisitive about other people as well. And I think it's quite interesting in current times, over the past few months with virtual working, more and more people saying that they're missing the anecdotal and the instantaneous conversations that people have, because what they're feeling is when they get into the virtual sessions, they have to get straight down to work, because it is more problematic to have that more informal conversation. And yet it's that informality of leaders that is probably the most conducive to your teams, your partners, your communities feeling they can trust you and they can work with you and they can be be themselves and give of their best if they know that you're prepared to reveal things about yourself and to open yourself up authentically. So I absolutely think, that is something that we've all got a responsibility to do, but it does require you to dig deep. But it's also a relief, I think, very often. Very often when people are struggling and they're talking about what they're struggling with, and you talk about who are you really? Forget about you as director X.
Yes.
But you as person Y.
Yeah.
Who are you? And once they start talking about that, bringing themselves, that changes the relationship they've got between themselves and their role.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely right. Catherine, do you have a view on that? How can we support leaders to bring their whole selves to work?
Yeah, Sherry, I mean, what you're talking about there really resonates. And a friend said to me that it's the paradox of trust. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the paradox of trust is this, that we don't have it until we give it.
Mm.
We don't have it until we give it. So there's a paradox in there somewhere in any community, and by extension in any leadership group, and by extension any team. There's a paradox of trust, which would lead me to say, how do we persuade people to bring their whole selves? By bringing your whole self.
Mm-hmm.
By bringing your whole self. That's how we create space for other people to do the same thing reciprocally, because that is the paradox of trust. But I think on some of this, Sherry, I think there's a lot of hope. So when I think about leaders whom I am learning most from at the moment, I would say nearly all of them are under the age of 25.
Wow.
When I think of who pushed me during the first wave, global wave, if you like, of Black Lives Matter as a rooted issue in this country, so the overthrow of the Colston statue in Bristol, it was people in my team, particularly a young woman, Zara Mahabath, organizing, again in a gentle, respectful, encouraging way, a group of colleagues to come and say, we want something to be said on this.
Mm.
We want you, nudge, nudge,
Good.
to use the platform that you have as a formal leader in our team, in the hierarchy, to say something with us on this. Yeah. And there was so much learning that came from that. So I think there is hope, and there is, in practical terms, huge opportunity for more established hierarchical leaders to reach in to the leadership potential in other generations that are coming up behind us.
Yeah.
And may in some ways overtake us in some of these conversations, and have as much to teach us.
Yes.
As we do.
That is such a powerful analogy that you've just drawn there. I think one of the things that the senior leaders, need to do is what you did, Catherine, which is you listened and you responded to the nudge that they gave you. You absolutely understood that, and you took that forward. Because if the power is with you in that sense, and if you had shut it down, you couldn't have taken that conversation forward. So it's equally important, as you've said, for leaders to not lose their ego, really, lose your ego, and ask and look and search for leadership amongst across the organizations you work for, amongst younger people, and listen to what the new conversations are about. I think they're very powerful. Yeah. Rosemary, we were talking offline a while ago, and you talked about blended leadership, and you gave us an example of a group of white school leaders who blended the Ubuntu system with leadership models. And I wonder how you persuaded them to get to that point. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Right. Well, it was, again, timing in all of this is crucial, because those leaders were already linked together in terms of cooperating and partnering with one another at a time when academization was being pushed as the way forward, and in terms of schools. And there was a resistance amongst them to start to compete with one another, which was where academization was part of the underpinning foundation of what the academization movement was about. So they were seeking, if you like, to retain that way of collaborating that they had and that partnership that they had. And so it didn't take much persuasion for them to look at a global paradigm that would actually strengthen the model of system leadership that they had. And so that global paradigm was Ubuntu, which is an African-centered model of leadership that focuses on the collective. It focuses on the we as opposed to the I. And it really says that there is no I without we. And one of the roles of leaders is to always work in the interests of the collective and in the interests of the greater good. And in actual fact, that the best leaders are those who speak to those within the wider society who have no voice, those who speak to and speak for those who have no voice. So this group of school leaders decided that they would kind of take the politics out of the policy direction and group together all of them to become academies, ironically, but that as academies, they were then going to exploit, if you like, the freedoms that the Secretary of State then gave academies for them to use their independence to work interdependently. And so they set up a trust, all of them as academies, and that trust was called Schools at One Darlington. And they use that model to actually say, and one of the things that we won't do is to compete. One of the things that we will do is to work in the interests of every Darlington child. And so it was a system leadership model that was blended with Ubuntu. And it felt very, very natural for that group of people. And also what it did was to encourage the individual leaders who were feeling a little bit isolated or feeling under pressure and overwhelmed, that they were now formally part of a family that were focused on really some very, very simple things. Darlington children, you know, they all focused on Darlington children. Yeah. And so what that meant was that they supported one another, and that they were accountable to one another. And not only that, they were able to weave a narrative that not only they bought into, but elected members bought into. And I remember one of those elected members saying, I should be able to go into Darlington Market on a Saturday afternoon and stand on my little soapbox and explain to the community that were going about their business on a Saturday afternoon shopping what Schools at One Darlington is about. And also then be able to go into the chambers on Monday and explain to my elected member colleagues what Darlington is all about. So It's a very kind of simple but profound model that speaks to the aspirations of the community that leadership is supposed to serve.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's really inspirational. But, Jo, Catherine, does that inspire you to pay more attention to the diversity of the material that you use or the content you create in your work?
Yeah, it does indeed. I guess, and this is one of those yes but moments. There's always that question of, and as you start exploring and understanding and using different models, how do you avoid the charge of appearing to appropriate something? And I don't know the answer to that. I'd be really interested in sort of other people's thoughts on that. Is that just something I'm making up as an excuse not to? Or is it something sort of very, very real? And how do you guard against that?
Yeah, Catherine?
I don't know the answer to that, Joe. I know a couple of thoughts I have on it. I mean, one is, we have a drive now within NHS England and NHS Improvement to increase the diversity on the basis of race of our most senior, what are called bands in the NHS, so bands 9, ESMs, and so on, and that we need to demonstrate proactive action on that. And one way of thinking about that is to go into interview and selection panels and be looking for opportunities to identify people who meet a benchmark and are talented, bring them forward to interview and so on. I guess when I looked around at our senior team when we were doing interviews 2 weeks ago, we are all white. We are all versions of white British or white European. So the answers to how we do that, both in terms of signifying the change, creating a truly inclusive panel and application experience for people, the answers didn't lie in our room. Mm-hmm. And so then the next thought that provoked was, so how do we ask for help? Who do we ask for support to make that change? And we did that. We reached out to various people with different expertise, different groups. And we had, I hope, a bit of humility to say, we don't really know the answers here, but we've got enough awareness now to see some of the problems. How do we do it differently? And there were people who then walked with us in doing that process differently, and that we had feedback on how that felt, both for them to be asked and for candidates to go through the process. So it's not an answer, it's more of a story, Joe, that speaks to maybe some of the seemingly small steps that are quite profound that we have in our gifts as leaders to take, predominantly around asking questions, really, and not pretending we have the answers.
Okay, that sounds like I like the idea of people walking with you. Rosemary, did you want to come in there?
Yes,
Rosemary?
I did, Sherry. I did, because what's really key. Yes, I did want to come in. Thank you so much. What I really found interesting and important about what both Catherine and Joe have just said is that it's not about us actually just looking at this as something that we have to bring into the conversation as something different. We can actually look at, and this is what the Darlington people did, they looked at what they were currently doing and they said that it wasn't working and they wanted something that was going to be different. And so they looked around the world, if you like, to find global paradigms that really fitted and merged well with the way that they were thinking and wanting to operate anyway. So it's not an appropriation, to go back to Joe's initial question, I think, to incorporate global ways of looking at leadership. Those global ways of looking at leadership belong to us all. So it's about simply acknowledging that we haven't embraced what is out there for all of us. And so we're not taking it from somewhere else to bring into ours. It's ours. Global paradigms are ours. So it's about us availing ourselves of all of the knowledge that is available to us. And so it means looking to other places, going to other academies, and of course, bringing other people into the conversation. So I think that gets away from this notion of appropriating, because if we look at appropriating as we do, as Black people talk about our culture being appropriated all of the time, but we're not actually included, so like our music or our food or whatever. The appropriation there that is, if you like, what we would resist is one that takes the best of those cultures and then doesn't recognize the contribution that the people and those cultures make to our own, our own development and our own interests. So for me, it's not about appropriating, it's about at last acknowledging that there's a big part of the global paradigm that belongs to all of us, that we can begin to make our lives and the way that we work much better and more relevant, because actually we're serving very diverse groups of people. So the narrow, linear, white male, Harvard business-esque approach is no longer appropriate in terms of taking us forward. So how can we enrich the best of that model by using what is out there? And so that's why, and a big part of it is about the authenticity. You see, if we had allowed people to bring their entire selves into the leadership piece, we would be much further ahead in terms of us being able to look at different ways of working. But subliminally, we have learned that parts of ourselves are not appropriate within our professional identity and the way that we go about leadership. So this is definitely African-esque, and this is about understanding that as human beings, we're physical, we're spiritual, we're intellectual, we're ancestral, and we're tribal. And so if we want the best of people, then we need to bring in our entire selves. And only when we bring in our entire selves can we be, as Joe said, authentic.
Yeah, that's so really powerful.
For me, it's understanding that.
That's a really powerful image of having your whole self with all those other aspects of yourselves, bringing them together in that way and walking to work and walking with people like that in work, so that there is authenticity in that. I wanted to draw this episode, the third and final episode of our series of podcasts, by asking a question really on behalf of our listeners, which is, how can we enable our listeners to have conversations like the ones we've been having? What advice would you give them so that they do feel brave enough to have these conversations? What do they need in their toolkit, I guess? Catherine?
Thanks for the question, Sherry. I mean, I think to answer this, I would just draw upon why I chose to be in this conversation. Aside from it being, an interesting topic and a chance to do some learning, it was the way that the invitation was made. So to cast back for listeners who've been with us since the first podcast, Rosemary was a participant in a session that I ran. Joe then connected us. We started a conversation. And Rosemary invited us into conversations as people who would have different perspectives that were of equal worth, of equal value, where we could learn as much from each other as from anything else. And it puts me in mind of actually a Harvard professor, a man called Marshall Gantz, who is a civil rights organizer and who I've worked with closely. He started work this year on the idea of respect. And he said to me about a month ago, it's interesting, if you look at the origin of the word respect, it means to look again, to respect, to see and hear, to be seen and to be heard. And it was that essence in the invitation from Rosemary that led me to do something that was uncertain, but where I felt pushed and safe to have a conversation without being mischaracterized, without risking feeling disrespected or giving disrespect, because we created the conditions in our relationship where we could share openly, where we could learn together. So I don't know if that helps listeners, but that strikes me as an important insight. That's
really helpful and powerful too. I am going to draw this final episode to a close. It's a massive thank you to my guests, Rosemary Campbell-Stephens, MBE, who dialed in from Jamaica and has been with us throughout this series from afar, but very, very near in some of the concepts that she has raised with us and has given us all food for thought. Catherine Pereira and Joe Davidson, they have shared their thoughts and feelings, and they have all taken the time out to help us understand a little bit more about race, diversity, and how we can get more comfortable with leadership constructs which are informed by the global majority. A huge thank you also to our listeners. If you've enjoyed this podcast series, please share it and use it to start your own courageous conversations. I'm Sherry Malik. I'm signing off on behalf of the Staff College, having courageous conversations about race.